So one of the conversations that I'm excited to have today is with my next guest. I'm going to introduce them by reading their bio and to talk about history and like when was America ever great? What are we actually referring to? So, with me today, I have Ty Seidule, who is a visiting professor at history at Hamilton College in New York, and executive director of Common Ground, Hamilton's acclaimed program designed to explore complex social issues and cross-boundary political thought. He served in the U.S. Army. Thank you for your service. For more than 3 decades, retiring in 2020 as a brigadier. You know that like never mind. I'll talk about it later. General. He is a professor emeritus at History of West Point and received its Distinguished Faculty Award. Welcome. He also created and co-edited the award-winning West Point History of Warfare, the largest enhanced digital book in any field. His video lecture was The Civil War About Slavery, has 35 million views on social media. Wow. So welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Thank you, homie. I appreciate you inviting me. What a pleasure.
All right. So MAGA and this idea of make America great again. Now, I want to speak to this because I think there's a sort of affirmation that they've given themselves that doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense. But I also want to equip our audience on how to think about the time we're in now versus the times we've been in. And how do we stay, I don't know, focused? Have we ever seen something that came up on the last call? I'm gonna start with this question. Something that came up on the last call was we talk about economic downturns and approaching another one, but is this one different? Is this actually we're living in an actual different time, or have we seen this kind of time before? So I'm curious from a historic standpoint, can this actually be compared to any other time in history?
Well, I think that, so thank you for asking it. I mean, we historians have a perfect track record of predicting the future. We're always wrong. So let me just start out with saying that. So we're not in the prediction business because, in fact, it is so hard for us just to figure out what happened in the past, much less trying to
Mm,
figure out what happened but we can look at certain periods of time and say, it particularly, I think it's effective to look at what does the person in the Oval Office think about right now. So in other words, what is he
mm,
looking to the past? Because if you look at what he's looking to the past, it kind of shows you, it's an insight into his mind. And he goes back to to Andrew Jackson or to William
mm,
McKinley. But the idea is that, and we can talk more about those periods if we want. But the idea is, there a period where America's great, and you try to get them to drill down. When was that period? And I've heard them say, "Oh, it's 1913, before there was an income tax." I said, "Well, then you know that the American South was an apartheid state at that period. Women couldn't have the vote. Is that when you're talking about? Well, the 1950s was a great time. Well, we had 40,000 Americans die in Korea. We were living under the threat of nuclear annihilation. And again, we lived in an apartheid state. So tell me, anytime you say when was America great, then you have all these problems about the people that actually lived in that period. So the answer to that question is, it's a feeling that they're trying to give you to think that somehow the past, it's a nostalgia for
mm.
some better time, but that better time wasn't ever there.
Mm. When
There's
I
no
try
better
to,
time.
there's no better time from a historian's standpoint. Is there no better time than the present?
Yeah, I think, if you think about it, there is never been a better time to be a human being on planet Earth than right now. If you look broadly, the poverty is dropping by huge measures all over the world. Disease is killing fewer people. Infant mortality is less than it's ever been. So there's all these things that would say that it's a better time to be a human now than at any other time before or since. And if you start going back into the past, then you start finding these terrible things. Like in
Mm,
1913, you still had disease and terrible things there. Now, what would Trump say? Trump would go and say, William McKinley, that was the time in the 1890s. My God, we were great because we had no income tax then. Well, remember, the budget was only 2 to 3, and we paying for things by tariff. Well, we only had 2 to 3% paid for by the federal government. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicaid. There was no Medicare. There wasn't any of the things that we see of as a modern society. There wasn't indoor plumbing. There weren't cars. So the idea that we're going to
Mm.
look at ourselves in the 1890s is just, it's terrible history. There's nothing worse, really, then using history is okay, but abusing history is more often the case it happens. And that's what Trump is doing now, is abusing history.
Mm. Speaking of that, I want to get your thoughts on the removal, the renaming of landmarks. So we went through a naming era, a moment where we're like, hey, let's take down all the Confederate generals, or let's change all of the different things. And now we're seeing a movement to change some of these things back, like from thinking about like the Gulf of America to Mount McKinley at Fort Bragg, or to Fort Bragg or Fort Benning, or the Black Lives Matter Plaza. How will these things impact history?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I was the vice chair of the naming commission that renamed all the Army bases and looked at the Department of Defense and took out everything that commemorated Confederates. So I think we should remember who the Confederates were. The Confederates chose treason to preserve slavery. So they were insurrectionists who refused to accept the results of a democratic election and violently tried to overthrow the government. And and to do and why were they doing this? This is to preserve the moral abomination of human enslavement. So that's who they were. And the only reason we named it after them is because we named it in the 1890s to the 1920s and the integration era. And with the reason we named them after them is because of white supremacy. The Reconstruction era, after the Civil War, we now had 2,000 Black men elected to higher office. There was an attempt at biracial democracy. By the 1890s, Southern societies had white people had taken over and redone the constitutions to create the Jim Crow society. So we took all those out of the Department of Defense. There are none of them left. And I was a part of that. It's what I write about. And I think it's a great sign of who America is who we commemorate, because who we commemorate reflects our values. That's what I think is so important. Who we commemorate reflects our values. And because we're fighting over that, the idea of who we commemorate will never go away. And we change things all the time.
Mm.
So for instance, I know you've probably been to New York and flown out of Idlewild Airport. Well, that's what JFK Airport used to be. Used to be Idlewild. And Reagan National, it didn't used to be Reagan. So we renamed those things. But Secretary Hegseth put the name back for Fort Bragg, which was Fort Liberty, and Fort Benning, which was named after Hal and Julie Moore, the first time we've ever had a base named after family. And he's doing that as a wink and a nod, I think, to Confederates. He didn't name them after Confederates, he named them after
Mm.
someone else. But this is but to try to name things after Confederates is just, to me, it's abominable. And I'm hoping that it'll go no further.
Let's talk about white supremacy for a second, because I want to talk about this historically. Is there a place where white supremacy became, and I want to think of the right word to word this. Where's there a place where it became, where it was inherent and then it was intentional, right? Like where it was like white white supremacy, but then because as I'm saying it, I'm thinking back to like Native Americans, and I'm thinking of slavery, and I'm like, it was always intentional, right? Do
Right.
you was it conscious in the way of like we're gonna be supremacists, or conscious in the way of like we want to preserve our culture?
No,
Like,
it's yeah.
is there a moment in time, like, is there a historical arc to it? Or it just is, and we're just always under it, and there's just like nothing else that can happen but it. Like, it's, I'm curious about
Yeah,
what, from a
it's
history.
power. It's political power. So after the Civil War, if you can imagine, I was at West Point teaching there for a number of years, and there were enslaved people at West Point in 1861. Less than 10 years later, there are cadets that are going to be officers in the Army who are African American, former enslaved people. Amazing, 10-year difference between that. And then the white people in the South saw this idea of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, 14th Amendment, which created equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all men. And this is a revolution. And so, and again, I said
Mm.
that this is black, there was biracial democracy in that period from 1865 to 1877. And the reaction to that was violence. And then the overthrow of the government, which happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, where there was an actual coup d'etat, and other places to ensure that there is white supremacy and that black people are the only way that they can go into the courthouse is as a custodian or as a defendant. And the Confederate monuments that go up are a symbol that the whites are back in the saddle. And so if you read the Confederate
Mm.
monument, the way that they did the speeches, it would say the Anglo-Saxons are back in power. So it's about power, and it's always intentional.
Is there is there a way to play against it? Or is there a way to play like, I think like, are we just hopeless against it? Or is there an actual way to is there a game that we could jump into? Like I'm curious about like empowerment and inside of this bucket of power and sort
Yeah.
of like what do people do? What did people do? What have people done?
Well, I think yes. So yes, there is. And so, I would say that as a friend of mine once said, we've come a long way, we have a long way to go. So
Mm,
if you think about that, and I think about it in the military, in the Army, where I spent my career, and we had tokenism among black officers up through the 1960s. So 0.2% of Marine officers, 0.2% of Navy officers. There were very few. And then we start equal opportunity. And there's a recognition among black officers, and civilian white people in charge that there's a systemic racism in the military, and that to fix that we have to do systemic solutions. That's where the equal opportunity comes from, and so that equal opportunity actually did indeed create a more fair. I mean, it didn't change everything because we're still Americans. We have a problem with racism, but it did make things a lot more fair. And so by the 1990, we have Colin Powell in a position as head of the military. So we do make these strides, but then we come to a period where we are today, where people are where there's a reaction against that. And so yes,
mm,
can humans make a difference? Can Americans make a difference? I always like to quote W.B. Du Bois, who has my favorite quote of all time, which is, "I love my country more than any other, and therefore I must criticize her." And I think that's the same that
mm.
today. We've got to make sure that we're making our voices heard and using historically informed arguments that there have been better times, and we can make a difference collectively.
I love that you said historically informed arguments because that's where I want to go. So what would be what are some historically informed arguments that we can be making today if people, want to make an impact or attempt to shift what is happening right now into a direction that is for more people to being included?
Yeah, well, I think it takes some expertise. So that's what, it depends on what is the subject that you want. So for me, it's about ensuring that we have in the military that we have equal opportunity for all. That we know that you're going to get a fair shot to get in a position of leadership. And I go back to this early 70s because until late through the 1960s, the military had tokenism among its officer class. Tokenism, just a very few people, like two or three a class at West Point. But then in the early
Mm,
70s, we go to dozens, hundreds of African Americans in the military in these leadership positions. And we can go and look at that and how we did that. And that created the equal opportunity that now the Trump administration is trying to destroy. So there have been these periods where we fight and work and make good choices where we come up. So whatever it is that you think, whether it's tariffs or whether it's small business or whether it's the military, if you go back and read about this, and this is what this administration is not doing, is they have no historically informed. They take history and they
mm.
abuse it rather than use it.
Let's go back into time a little bit around the efforts to privatize government, or has there been, and I'm not sure in terms of like spanning outside the U.S., people who did overthrow fascism and how they went about it. So, but you know, how do you do that? Like what does history tell us about what is happening right now in terms of the attempt to privatize government, right? And then what does history tell us about ways to overthrow fascism?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this idea of what we're doing to government right now, I don't know that we have something where we've seen the wholesale because they're not trying to build anything; they're just trying to destroy. So the idea that they're private, I don't think they're privatizing either. They're just destroying. And, we don't know what that's going to look like. We do know, however, that it's sort of like the physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. There's going to be a reaction to this when we don't know what's going to happen yet. Again, this is the thing about future. So it's preparing for when this crisis hits. And that when that crisis hits, that's when experts in every field should be ready to say, okay, this is a crisis. This broke. Here's how we're going to fix it. And so I know think tanks are doing this, and think tanks on the center left are thinking, what are we going to do when this thing finally breaks, and be ready for what that's going to do. And because I think it is going to break. And when it breaks, there's going to be anger among the American people and there's going to be, then what are we going to do about that? And this idea of thinking in time. So I think that's in a way what we're doing as historians is like, okay, look at the past, but look at a bunch of different things in the past. Don't look at just one
Mm-hmm.
analogy, because one
Right,
analogy is
right.
going to get you in trouble. Look at a bunch.
Mm.
Look at a bunch of different analogies, and then look at the likenesses and differences between that time period and try to come up with a plan going forward. But this is hard work. It's hard work because history doesn't give us lessons, it gives us wisdom.
Mm. Well, if people want to start, where should do you think they should start? Like let's say they want to begin to form their thoughts around how to prepare themselves, or their thoughts around, what demands I should be thinking about, or their thoughts around starting some kinds of movements of their own. Where would you say is the first place for them to go and start research? Is it an era of time? Is it a particular book?
Yeah, I think it depends on each issue. So each issue, here's a book that I really like, and it's about how to use history for decision makers, and it's called Thinking in Time. And what this Thinking in
Mm.
Time does is to tell, and the book's 35 years old, and it's by two Harvard professors that said, I'm going to prepare people that are going into government to think about how to use history and not be abused by it. Because the thing about it is what Trump is doing by going back to William McKinley and Andrew Jackson is abusing history. It's terrible. So just the idea of being able to spot bad history and be able to say, no, 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 you're full of bunk, is a place to start. So that when somebody says something, because we can't know everything. I know military history, and I know the history of the Black experience at West Point, and the history, and that's the book I'm writing about right now, or the book I just finished, which is about the base naming. So you've got to be able to say you can't know everything. So whatever it is that's your passion, find the experts on that, read what they're saying about it, and that's going to get you there. And the idea that we can together collectively find ways that we all have our area of expertise and then write about it. The other thing I always think is I never know what I think about
Mm.
something until I write about it. That's the
Write
way I
about
know
it.
about it. So I think that idea of how can you write about it? And then you flood the zone. They are flooding the zone. We can do the same thing because they're brilliant people like you and other people who are thinking about issues of import to the greater American community. Because guess what? We want to make this country better. Again, I love my country. I love this country. I was willing to fight and die for this country. But what the
Right.
route that we're on right now, that isn't the route that I want to be on. I want to change this place and make it a better place for all Americans.
I love that. Thank you so much, Ty Seidule, for joining me. We got to go to a quick break. I really appreciate your insight today. You listen to Urban View Mornings. I'm Omi Bell. We'll be right back.